The grand oak doors of the Chicago District Court swung open, and all eyes turned toward the young man being led to the defendant's table. Jordan Hayes, 19 years old, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. The soft shuffle of paperwork and the occasional murmur from the courtroom audience filled the space, but beneath it all was an unmistakable tension, one thick with skepticism and quiet amusement. At the bench, Judge Malcolm Whitmore adjusted his glasses, peering over them at the teenager standing before him. A veteran of the legal system, he had seen countless defendants pass through his courtroom, and to him, Jordan was just another name on another case file. From the prosecutor's side of the room, Attorney Leonard Price smirked, his polished shoes tapping against the floor as he leaned toward his colleague. "This is going to be quick," he muttered. "Kid's got no chance." Jordan, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, seemed impervious to the silent judgments swirling around him. He didn't fidget. He didn't slouch. If anything, he stood taller as he was asked to confirm his name. "Jordan Hayes," he said clearly, his voice firm yet calm. Judge Whitmore, arms crossed, let out a slow breath before addressing him. "Mr. Hayes, you stand accused of grand theft auto. Do you have legal representation, or will you be requesting a public defender?" A small chuckle rippled through the room. The gallery, packed with spectators and curious law students, had heard rumors that this kid wanted to represent himself. Surely, that couldn't be true. Then, Jordan spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I will be representing myself." The room fell into an almost stunned silence. Judge Whitmore blinked. Even the court stenographer hesitated for a moment before continuing her typing. Attorney Price's smirk widened. "Self-representation?" he repeated, amusement dripping from his tone. "Your Honor, if the defendant insists on wasting the court's time with—" "I am well aware of my rights," Jordan interrupted, turning toward the judge, "and I fully intend to exercise them." Judge Whitmore studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he gestured toward the prosecutor. "Very well. Mr. Hayes, you may proceed with your defense." A few chuckles echoed from the back of the courtroom. A young man, barely old enough to drink, was about to go head-to-head with a seasoned prosecutor. No law degree, no legal team, just himself. But what they didn't know was that Jordan Hayes had been preparing for this moment his entire life. What happened next would leave everyone in the courtroom speechless. If you want to see how Jordan dismantles the prosecution's case with nothing but his wit and knowledge, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next chapter of this incredible true story. The moment Jordan Hayes announced that he would be representing himself, the courtroom erupted into a low murmur of amusement and disbelief. Soft chuckles and whispered remarks spread like wildfire through the gallery. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others shook their heads, already convinced of the outcome. Seated at the prosecution's table, Attorney Leonard Price leaned back in his chair with a smirk, turning slightly toward his assistant. "This kid's either brave or completely clueless," he muttered. "Either way, this won't take long." Judge Malcolm Whitmore exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the wooden bench. He had seen his fair share of defendants over the years, and in his experience, those who represented themselves usually met a swift and humiliating defeat. "This should be interesting," he muttered under his breath, barely masking his skepticism. He adjusted his glasses and peered down at Jordan, his expression laced with doubt. But Jordan didn't flinch. He remained standing tall, his posture unwavering. He met the judge's gaze with a steady confidence that defied his age. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said clearly, "I believe I can effectively defend myself." A single moment of silence stretched across the room, as if waiting for the inevitable punchline. Then, a wave of quiet laughter rippled through the audience. A few people shook their heads, convinced they were about to witness a train wreck in real time. Judge Whitmore let out a slow sigh. "Very well, Mr. Hayes. Proceed." As his words settled over the courtroom, the laughter subsided, but the skepticism remained. The prosecutor shuffled his papers, already preparing his argument. The judge leaned back slightly, ready to watch this young man struggle. But what no one realized, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even the snickering audience, was that Jordan Hayes was about to turn this entire case upside down. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Jordan Hayes stepped forward. He placed his hands on the defendant's table, his fingers barely grazing the surface, steady and sure. Across the room, Attorney Leonard Price leaned forward, his smirk widening as if he were a cat about to pounce on a mouse. "All right, Mr. Hayes," Price said, flipping through his notes with exaggerated ease. "Let's not waste the court's time. The prosecution will now present its first witness." Officer Samuel Reynolds, the lead witness and arresting officer, took the stand. He adjusted his uniform and cleared his throat, his presence exuding the quiet authority of a man used to having his testimony taken at face value. "Officer Reynolds," Price began, "please tell the court how you came to arrest the defendant." The officer nodded. "At approximately 8:45 p.m., I received a report of a stolen black sedan near Westfield Avenue. I was patrolling nearby and spotted the vehicle about 3 blocks from the reported location. The defendant was standing next to the driver's side door, appearing suspicious. When I approached, he attempted to walk away. That's when I detained him." "Thank you, officer," Price said smoothly. "No further questions." Judge Whitmore turned to Jordan. "Mr. Hayes, you may cross-examine the witness." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. The idea of a teenager questioning a seasoned officer was almost comical to them. Jordan, however, remained unfazed. He picked up a small notepad, though he hardly looked at it. Instead, he studied Officer Reynolds for a moment before speaking. "Officer Reynolds, you said you were patrolling nearby when you received the stolen vehicle report, correct?" "Yes." "And how far were you from the reported location?" The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Roughly 3 to 4 blocks. Jordan nodded. "That's interesting, because according to the GPS logs from your patrol car," he pulled out a printed document, holding it up for the judge, "you were actually 7 blocks away when the report came in." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The officer's jaw tightened. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Where did you obtain these GPS logs, Mr. Hayes?" Jordan kept his tone measured. "Public records request, Your Honor. According to these logs, Officer Reynolds' vehicle didn't arrive near the scene until several minutes after the alleged sighting, which raises the question, how did he see me standing next to the stolen car before he even arrived?" The tension in the room thickened. "Officer," Jordan continued, pacing slightly, "could you clarify how you visually identified me from such a distance before you were even in the area?" Officer Reynolds swallowed, his polished confidence showing its first crack. I might have miscalculated the distance." Jordan tilted his head. "Miscalculated? Or were you relying on assumption rather than fact?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. From the judge's bench, Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his skepticism giving way to something resembling intrigue. The chuckles in the audience had long since faded, replaced with murmurs of surprise. Jordan had just exposed the first crack in the prosecution's case, and he was only getting started. A tense silence stretched across the courtroom as Jordan Hayes walked back to the defendant's table, his expression calm and unreadable. Across from him, Attorney Leonard Price shuffled his notes, his smirk faltering just slightly. "All right, Mr. Hayes," Price said, regaining his composure. "You may have created some doubt about Officer Reynolds' testimony, but let's talk about hard evidence." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit C, fingerprint analysis from the crime scene." The bailiff carried a folder to Judge Whitmore, who took a quick glance before nodding. Price walked confidently toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is irrefutable proof. The defendant's fingerprints were found inside the stolen vehicle, including on the steering wheel. That alone is enough to prove he was inside the car. And why would his prints be there unless he was the one who stole it?" The jury murmured amongst themselves. It was a solid point. The prosecution had played its trump card. Judge Whitmore turned to Jordan. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to respond?" Jordan nodded and stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "Absolutely, Your Honor." With measured steps, he walked to the jury box, his voice steady and clear. "Let me ask you all something," he began. "If I were to touch this podium right now, would that make me its owner?" The jurors exchanged puzzled glances. Jordan turned to Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor, if you pick up a book in the library and put it back, does that mean you stole it?" The judge leaned back slightly, considering the question. "Of course not." Jordan faced the jury again. "Exactly. My fingerprints only prove one thing, that I touched the car. They don't prove when, why, or for how long. He turned back to Price. Tell me, Mr. Price, did the prosecution find any other evidence inside the car? Price stiffened. What are you getting at, Mr. Hayes? Jordan picked up the crime scene report from the table and held it up, because according to this, there were no palm prints, no smudges, and no partials suggesting prolonged contact, just a few clear fingerprints on the steering wheel. He let that sink in before continuing. Now, let's assume for a moment that I did sit in that car. How long would it take for my fingerprints to get on the wheel? He held up his index finger and tapped the wooden defense table lightly. A second? 2 seconds? Price's jaw tightened. That's irrelevant. It's completely relevant, Jordan countered smoothly, because the prosecution wants you to believe that touching something means you stole it. But we don't convict people based on assumptions. Judge Whitmore glanced at Price. Prosecution, do you have evidence showing how long the defendant's fingerprints were on the steering wheel? Price hesitated. No, Your Honor. Jordan nodded. I didn't think so. He turned to the jury one last time. Fingerprints tell a story, but without context, they're just marks on a surface, and right now, all we have are assumptions and missing details. Silence. Even the murmurs from the audience had died down. Judge Whitmore drummed his fingers against his bench, his skepticism now replaced with something else, respect. Leonard Price looked down at his notes, but there was nothing left to say. Jordan had just dismantled another key piece of the prosecution's case, and he wasn't done yet. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The prosecutor, Leonard Price, sat rigid in his chair, his once confident smirk completely erased. Judge Malcolm Whitmore tapped his gavel lightly against his bench, deep in thought. The jury members, who had started the trial convinced of Jordan Hayes' guilt, now exchanged uncertain glances. Jordan, standing tall at the defendant's table, exhaled slowly. He had dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, exposing the contradictions, the weak evidence, and the blind assumptions. Now, all that remained was the final verdict. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice firm yet thoughtful. Mr. Price, after reviewing the evidence, or lack thereof, it appears that the prosecution has failed to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A visible tension rippled through the gallery. Some leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged quiet murmurs. Price's jaw clenched. Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant's fingerprints have already been challenged and deemed inconclusive, Judge Whitmore interrupted. And let's not forget the inconsistencies in the officer's testimony. Jordan kept his face neutral, though his pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the moment, the decision that would either set him free or brand him a criminal for life. Judge Whitmore took a deep breath. This court is not in the business of convicting individuals based on weak evidence and circumstantial claims. The foundation of our legal system is justice, not assumption. He straightened in his chair. As such, the charges against Mr. Jordan Hayes are hereby dismissed. For a split second, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. Then, chaos. Gasps, whispers, even a few cheers erupted from the gallery. A woman in the front row wiped away tears, while a law student near the back scribbled notes furiously, clearly aware that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Jordan stood still, absorbing the words. It was over. He had won. Price, clearly frustrated, slammed his folder shut. He cast Jordan a final, unreadable look before turning away. Judge Whitmore rapped his gavel against the wood. Court is adjourned. As Jordan gathered his papers, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see an older man, perhaps a retired attorney, smiling at him. You've got a gift, son, the man said. Don't waste it. Jordan nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. As he stepped out of the courtroom into the bright Chicago sun, a flood of reporters and onlookers swarmed him. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward his face. How did you know what to say in there? One reporter asked. Jordan took a deep breath, then smiled. I've been studying the law for years, and I knew that if I didn't fight for myself, no one else would. The cameras clicked. The questions kept coming. But Jordan was already thinking ahead about law school, about advocacy, about helping others who weren't as lucky or as prepared as he had been. Today, he had been the defendant. One day, he would be the attorney. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, and Jordan Hayes stepped into the warm afternoon light. The crisp Chicago air filled his lungs, carrying with it the weight of his victory. He had walked into that courtroom as a defendant, mocked and underestimated. Now he was walking out as a free man, a man who had proven not only his innocence, but his brilliance. But as soon as his feet hit the courthouse steps, he was met with a sea of flashing cameras and eager reporters. Microphones were shoved toward him from every angle, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Jordan, how did you manage to dismantle the prosecution's case? Were you ever afraid you'd lose? Did you have legal training? Who taught you?" The questions came fast, but Jordan remained calm, just as he had been in the courtroom. He adjusted his sleeves and offered a small, confident smile. "I studied," he said simply. "I learned the law because I knew one day I might need it." A reporter pressed forward. "So, what's next for you? Will you pursue law as a career?" Jordan paused. That was the question, wasn't it? He glanced over his shoulder at the towering courthouse behind him. Inside those walls, justice was often a game, one where the wealthy, the privileged, and the powerful held the advantage. Today, he had beaten the system at its own game. But what about those who weren't as prepared? What about the people who didn't have the knowledge, the courage, or the resources to defend themselves? His mind flashed back to the faces he had seen in holding cells. Young men just like him, sitting behind bars, unable to afford decent lawyers. People who had been swallowed up by a system that wasn't built to protect them. He turned back to the crowd. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to law school, and one day I'll be back in that courtroom. But next time, I'll be the one fighting for someone else." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. The cameras clicked even faster now, capturing the moment. A teenager who had just outwitted an entire legal system, now vowing to change it. As Jordan stepped away from the reporters, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a flood of messages. Friends, family, even complete strangers who had heard about his case. Some congratulated him, others asked for advice, and a few pleaded for help with their own legal battles. Jordan's jaw tightened. He had won his case, but this was bigger than just him. This was about something greater. About fairness, about justice, about making sure no one else had to fight alone. He took a deep breath and made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Want to hear more stories of justice, perseverance, and unexpected victories? Subscribe now and follow Jordan's journey as he takes on the legal world, one case at a time.